Thank you for having me back again. Some of you may have been here 2 years ago when I talked about congressional elections in 2016, and people were less interested in congressional elections then, so hopefully you don't remember what I said if you were here 2 years ago. I always warn all my audiences that academics tend to take on the attributes of whatever they study. And because I've spent a good deal of my time studying Congress over my professional career, and the Senate in particular, I do tend to filibuster. So I am going to try and finish up and leave you adequate time to ask questions and try to respond to those questions. My talk today is I couldn't quite figure out what to do because there were so many things to cover. So I decided to cover 10 things you ought to know about the elections, right? So this is sort of a reverse David Letterman without the jokes. We will start from number 1 and go up to number 10 and see how that works. Hopefully congressional elections aren't an afterthought for you this year as they were 2 years ago. And so I want to talk about a variety of things about congressional elections. And the first, number 1, is the times they are a-changin'. And I'll give you a small anecdote to let you know why I think things are changing. And they are changing in very big ways, even if we do not see it this year fully. In March, the week that midterm exams were being given at Vanderbilt, the week that at the end of the week students were going to take off for spring break, so you know their minds were elsewhere, the undergraduate political science organization students asked me to come and give an evening talk on the midterm elections. I didn't think anybody would be much interested in the midterm elections in March, and they might be studying for the midterms. And so I said yes, because I very rarely turn down student requests. And I showed up at a room in Buttrick, and I expected 10 people, at max 15. And I expected them to be primarily male and primarily students I really knew well. Those were the people who would show up, the real junkies who were thinking about midterm elections rather than studying for their midterm exams. I walked into the room, and it was packed. There were 72 students there, and 90% of them were female. And so I came out of that, and I said, something's happening here, and what it is ain't exactly clear. And then I went home and played Bob Dylan singing "The Times They Are Changing." So the first thing to say is, and I'll talk about this more, something's going on. There is a change going on in the society, and there are people, for whenever there is large change going on in society, who will, they're risk averse, and they will resist that, and there will be push back and forth, and the change will not occur in a single election or a single year, but there's change going on out there, and we have to acknowledge that and recognize that. And some of the indicators that I'll talk about when I talk about this election will be where we expect change to be showing up. And I just don't think we understand what the magnitude of that change is going to be as yet. So that's point number 1. And I think the question is not whether change is occurring, but how rapidly it's occurring and what the magnitude of that change is likely to be. And how long those who want to resist whatever this change, and it may be more than one change, how long those who want to resist this change are going to be able to hold back what's going on out there. Well, the first thing I'd like to talk to you about, well, actually the second after that, is analysis of states holding Senate elections. And the reason I talk about that is the following. This year, there are 35 Senate elections, 2 to fill parts of terms which have not expired of senators who are no longer serving. And that's 1 in Mississippi and 1 in Minnesota. So there are 2 Senate races in both of those states, technically. And then 33 others. And the current holders of those seats are 26 Democrats and 9 Republicans. Now, you may say, but the Senate is 51 Republicans and 49 Democrats. Why do we have a class like this? And what does that mean? After all, one would think that, with an even split in the Senate, you'd have an even split in each class. Instead, you have 3 very skewed classes. 1 that's made up heavily of Democratic senators, and 2 that are made up heavily of Republican senators. So why do we have this mix? Well, the first reason is the mix of states that are Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3 senators as designated. In other words, the years those states are supposed to have Senate elections are not sort of randomly assigned. They are not a random selection of the states. They have to do when the states were admitted. So the first state, Delaware, was given a Class 1 and Class 2 senator, right? Pennsylvania was second. I don't know if it got a 1 and a 3 or 2 and a 3. And so on. As a state entered a union, it would, if there were an equal number of senators in each class, that state would have the ability to say, I want a 1 and a 2, I want a 1 and a 3, I want a 2 and a 3. But if it wasn't an equal number, which it wasn't, you would be assigned senators to keep that in balance as it went along. And oddly enough, it creates classes that look like this, right? And as you look at that, you can see from Michigan and Indiana, and if you want to throw in Minnesota and Wisconsin, east, and from Virginia north, every state but New Hampshire has a Senate race this year. Right? You'd expect 2 out of 3 of those states to have Senate races. But every state, and if you look in the South, it's all right to count the border south of Virginia, Florida, and Texas. Okay, but there are relatively few states in the South that have Senate races this year, right? And if you look along the West Coast, throw in Hawaii, 3 of the 4 states have Senate races. So it is a grouping of states. It is a class that is made up with a lot of Democratic states or Democratic-leaning states, right? Doesn't mean there aren't any. Now, given that, we might expect this class to be more heavily Democratic than the other 2, which it is. But then there is a second thing which makes it so heavily Democratic. The people running in 2018, this Senate class, right, was last elected in 2012. A good Democratic year. Barack Obama was reelected quite comfortably over Mitt Romney. Democrats surprisingly preserved their Senate majority. And that Senate majority in that class was from 6 years earlier, 2006, which was another very good year for the Democrats. And if you think 2018 is likely to be a good year for the Democrats, then they're likely to be able to preserve a good part of this majority in this class, right? Claire McCaskill, right? Senator from Missouri, Democratic senator from Missouri in a state that's been voting Republican pretty heavily for a while. She won in 2006, she won in 2012, and she may win again may or may not win again in 2018, but she's run in 3 good Democratic years. Right? So that's important to understand. This was potentially a big opportunity year for the Republicans. Lots of Democratic targets, few Republican seats to protect. And remember, those are Republican seats where Republicans won in 2012, not where Republicans lost in 2012, in a not very good year. So you would think that those Republican seats are hard for Democrats to win, and the Democratic seats are a bit more vulnerable, except you have a year that it looks like the Democrats are going to have an edge in congressional elections. It may not be a big enough edge to preserve 26-9, right? Or to give the Democrats a chance of winning a majority in the Senate. That's, at the margins. But it is probably a big enough situation where, and we'll look at this in a little bit, where Democrats will finish with a class which is pretty heavily Democratic class still. The problem with that is it will be a lost opportunity for Republicans. So remember, the class that gets elected this year, they're there for 6 years. And then you worry about this class, the class up in 2020, which, as you can see, is pretty heavily Republican. It's about 22-11, something like that. Right? Again, look at the mix of states. They're more favorable to Republicans, but still, there are some Senate seats, Colorado, Maine, et cetera, that may be in play. And similarly, 2022. Again, a class that will have targets for Democrats. The big loss for the Democrats in 2016, aside from losing the presidency, was they didn't make gains in Senate seats, where the Republicans were very vulnerable, were very exposed. So those people they're there until 2022, and this class is going to be there till 2024, right? So it may have something to do with what's the majority party, even if the Democrats don't win the majority in 2018. It may affect who's the majority party after 20 and who's the majority party after 2022. Okay. Let's talk about women a little bit. I didn't mean it that way. Let's talk about women candidacies. We've seen on a range, and I don't have to tell you about this, but, the after effects of the 2016 election, the marches of women's groups in Washington and elsewhere, the reaction, and we'll talk more about it a little bit, to the Cavanaugh nomination, the Me Too movement, the people who showed up at my midterm elections talk, the growth, as you will see, in women candidates for Congress. And so I put this up. This is just House of Representatives. And if we look first, there are, in the current Congress, there are 61 Democrats in the House, 23 Republicans, a total of 84 women in the House of Representatives currently. In terms of primary elections this year, 183 women Democrats won congressional primaries. 52 Republican women won congressional primaries. So there are 235 women candidates running for the House of Representatives in the general election. That's the largest ever, right? Those are record numbers. And here are the expectations of what's going to, whoops. Oh, let me give you here's what the Senate looks like. 23 women in the Senate currently, 17 Democrats, 6 Republicans. Of the 35 Senate races up, there are 15 Democrats who won primaries, 7 Republicans, and that does not count the Mississippi seat, which has a woman appointed to fill the Thad Cochran vacancy, and they're actually having, I don't quite understand the electoral law, but they're having technically a primary election in Mississippi on November 6th for that seat, which involves both Democratic and Republican candidates. And so she's not counted because she hasn't won that primary yet. So, okay, just thought I'd throw that in. Here's the more interesting data. Is this going to be like 1992, the year of the woman? That's a real question. In 1992, 48 women were elected to the House of Representatives. There had only been 30 prior to that. And in the Senate, 6 were elected. There had only been 2 prior, right? So that became the year of the woman. That's where this, you know. And since then, the number of women in Congress has gone up incrementally, right? We haven't had another big surge following that. And that's following the Anita Hill thing, remember? So you have some comparisons there. So here we have, of those primary winners, 235 of them, 183 Democrats, 52 Republicans. 73 of the Democrats are favored to win, 17 of the Republicans are favored to win. If only those people win, there'll be 90 women in the House of Representatives, up from 84. There are 12 Democratic women in toss-ups, 4 Republican women in toss-ups, and you probably can't read this little thing down here, but 4 of the toss-up candidates are competing against each other. So we know at least 2 more women will get elected in those toss-up races, right? And then, as you see, there are 128 women who are running in races where their opponent is favored and their opponent is male. And there's one who's one seat where there's a withdrawal. There are going to be more women. How many? It's hard to say. Probably at least 92 in the House of Representatives. Maybe more, depending on how successful women candidates are. And one thing you should look at is, you know, how many do more than 92 win? How big is this wave? How activated are women? How much do women want to, and others want to vote for women candidates? Once thought to be a liability is being a female candidate in 2018 an asset. The other thing you should be very clear about is, as much as we talk about a gender gap in the electorate, the gender gap in Congress is bigger, right? So, you know, if you look at that figure, right, in the favored to win column, you're talking about 73 Democrats and 17 Republicans. Actually, an increase in the number of Democratic women, decline in the number of Republican women in the House of Representatives, right? So we're looking at a trend which has become where Democratic women outnumber Republican women in Congress by 3 to 4 to 1. And that tells you something. Each party has a problem. If you want to look at it, it would be the Republicans have trouble recruiting women candidates, and with female voters, the other way of looking at it is that the Democrats have a trouble with male voters, right? But I don't know how you want to look at it. I'm not going to tell you how to look at that, because that will get me in a lot of trouble. Okay. I don't have, we'll go back to the Senate in a few minutes, right? And so it's harder to predict what the numbers will look like in the Senate. Okay. Turnout at midterms. Turnout at midterms, and I'm not going to surprise you with any of this, is always lower than turnout in presidential election years, right? Sizably lower. Everybody worries about turnout in presidential years. They talk a lot about turnout. That violates one of my rules of politics. I don't know, I give them numbers, but I just make up the numbers as I go along. So I'll call it number 47 for lack of any, you know. Next time I'll call it number 17, I don't care. But one of my rules is politics is this irony. The higher turnout is in an election, the less important turnout is. And the lower turnout is in an election, the more important turnout is. Because when there's high turnout, it's hard to get an edge on turnout. Yes, it may be important that it's a high turnout election, but if a lot of people are voting, even marginal people who do not normally vote, then one side or the other has a hard time getting an advantage. So turnout is more important in midterm elections than it is in presidential election years because turnout is lower, meaning that candidates or parties can get a bigger differential advantage out of turnout. If you want to know where turnout really counts, it's in primary elections because turnout is even lower there, right? So people win primary elections based on can they turn their people out? Are they organized? Do they have name ID? Do they have intensity of support? You win general elections from having breadth of support, but the lower the turnout is in the general election, the more your ability to mobilize your voters is important. And so, enthusiasm makes a difference in midterms, but probably doesn't make much of a difference in a presidential election year. Differentials in enthusiasm, and depending on what polls you're looking at, some of them, and this is, I'm not going to tell you which ones to look at or which ones to believe. There are, I have my colleague Josh Clinton will come in at a later point and talk more about polling. Although I heard this morning, those of you who looked at the Tennessean this morning, you're still newspaper readers here, I think. The CBS poll isn't any good, so don't pay attention to it. It's got a lot of problems. I was told, one, it has no Hispanic voters in Tennessee in the poll, which is problematic. It's not a large, but there are none, right? There are some things with its administration. It showed 20% of African Americans who were surveyed were going to vote for Blackburn. So probably not going to be that high. But that's just an example of problems with the poll, right? Which you go down and say, so whether it's, one way or another, it's just not a very good poll. So don't read too much into it. Maybe right, maybe not right, but, a lot of polls aren't that good, even if they're organizations which you think probably are doing good polling. So anyway, polling for enthusiasm is problematic, but some polls have been showing a pretty big gap that, unlike 2014, where Republican voters were more enthusiastic than Democratic voters, in this one, Democratic voters are more enthusiastic or potential than Republican voters. Does that mean, and there are some showing, well, after the Cavanaugh thing that has changed, and others showing it doesn't. Depends. It may make a difference this time. That is, because enthusiasm is a good indicator of the likelihood of turning out, and it may say that Democratic voters are more likely to turn out than Republican voters this year. Got to factor that in. But I wouldn't worry about that as much in a presidential election year as I would in a midterm election year. So enthusiasm may make a difference. And then there's the other question, are women voters more likely to turn out? It's not just that there's a gender gap in the electorate. The question is, in this election year, will we get higher than expected turnout among women than we would normally get in a midterm? And to take advantage of that gender gap difference, right? I don't know. But it's the one thing I'd start looking at, right? Are women more enthusiastic about voting than men? And is that what's contributing to this differential? That leads me to point 5. The Cavanaugh effect. So what's the spillover from the Cavanaugh nomination, right? Will anybody worry about it 4 weeks, well, a day less than 4 weeks from now, right? Will it have the same impact? So I'm going to tell you what I thought before the Senate hearings that you saw the last week and before the FBI investigation. Because I might as well be honest and say, what did I think would happen then? After all, I just don't blow with the wind. You know, I'd be like the weatherman telling you what the weather's going to be like tomorrow, and you want to know what it's going to be like, you know, 2 weeks ahead of time. So, you know, I'm pretty good at predicting tomorrow, but I'm not, you know, that's not real talent. Real talent is being able to tell you, you know, before something happens a little bit. So my argument has been the following, that there's an irony here. When you have one of these sorts of issues, the winners are the losers and the losers are the winners. What do I mean by that? When you have an issue, an event that comes up and very quickly polarizes people and they pay a lot of attention to it, and it's followed by an election somewhat shortly after, the side that wins the fight often suffers negative electoral consequences, and the side that loses the fight, that's the side that gets mobilized for the election. So the losers are dissatisfied, and they go out and say, this is awful, we got to do something about it. And the winners say, we won, we can relax now. Now that's an exaggeration. But I think we see it all the time. When a state legislature or a court, for example, issues an opinion that strongly favors pro-life people, the pro-choice people get activated. And when the reverse happens, the pro-life people get activated. I think it's the same sort of thing. You know, the losers, you know, they get the veins in their teeth about it, and the winners are a little more satisfied. I can be wrong. I'll talk about that later. So my sense is, yes, maybe it mobilized both sides a bit to vote. There's some indication that, you know, the Trump people think that this will mobilize Republicans, or it has mobilized Republicans too, who were less mobilized than Democrats, less enthusiastic. So we'll have to, you know, that's why we're going to wait 4 weeks and find out. But my gut reaction is, you know, the losers always really want to get back. The winners, not so much. Okay. How are we doing? I think I can make it. I want to talk about the Republicans' House problem. We talked about the Democrats' Senate problem, right? They've got too many seats up. Right? Too many targets for Republicans. Democrats don't have enough Republicans they can target. We'll come back to that. You know? Here's the Republicans' problem, and you're not going to be able to read all those names, right? So this is the Cook Political Report, and this is their ratings from last week. And they are not including the seats which they say are safe. They are looking at from the far darker blue across seats which are contested, which they say are likely Democratic. Then the light blue is lean Democratic. The third column is Democratic toss-up rated. Then there are Republican toss-up, lean Republican, and likely Republican. You see those columns? And the color of each is then whether it is currently held by a Democrat or a Republican. Right? So I'm not going to make you take out magnifying glasses to look at this, or binoculars. Let me try to give you an idea. First, I just want to mention there are no Tennessee seats in there, right? So all 9 Tennessee House seats are safe for one party or another. 2 are safe for Democrats, 7 are safe for Republicans. None of those are in play, as far as I can tell. If any of those happens to change, would be a big surprise. Of the toss-up seats, combining the Republican and Democratic toss-up seats, 2 are currently held by Democrats, 29 are held by Republicans. of the ones that are worse than toss-ups, right? Seats which are held by Republicans which now either lean or are likely Democratic, or seats that are held by Democrats which either lean or are likely Republican. There's one that's worse than a toss-up for the Democrats. It's a Pennsylvania seat, which was part of that big Pennsylvania redistricting. And 13 are held by Republicans. So that means that there are 3 toss-up or worse seats that Democrats held, and 42 that Republicans hold. That's not good if you're a Republican. And if you look at the leans, there's 1 seat that Democrats hold that leans Democratic, and 26 that Republicans now hold that lean Republican. So if you combine that, you have a total of 4 Democratic House seats which are vulnerable, and 68 Republican House seats which are vulnerable. Now, you realize that leaves you with about 370 seats which aren't in play, okay? But that's a problem for the Republicans, right? It's why the Democrats are likely to win control of the House of Representatives. 24 seat ship, 25 seat, something in that range. So this is the Republicans' big headache right here. This is the wave and the effect of the wave and the effect of a few other things that are going on. The fact that Republicans currently probably have 10 to 15 more seats than they ought to have, that they've picked up over time. They're a little above where equilibrium should be. And we'll get back to predictions, but that's the real headache. They have no targets of Democratic seats, and there are lots of targets of Republican seats. Okay. Prediction model. Oops. Oh, here's the Senate. I wanted to give you that. There are 8 Senate seats which are considered toss-ups, 4 held by Democrats, 4 held by Republicans currently. So control of the Senate is probably going to be decided by those 8 seats. There are 3 Democratic leaners. We have to see about the West Virginia and the Montana seat, but they have not been in the toss-up range. That will decide who controls the Senate, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. Right? Again, look at the number that are solid, right? So you would think the Democrats are in real trouble. Look at the number that are likely Democratic or solidly Democratic. I mean, they're in places Democrats are going to win. Right? It's the mix of states. Okay. How are we doing? All right. We'll get through this and leave you time for questions. Prediction models, forecasting models. Political scientists and some economists, although I don't like to count the economists in on this, but we develop various predicting and forecasting models. I used to do this. I sold my stock after bad predictions in 1994. But I still read what these people do, and there are all sorts of theories and bases of their models, right? And I'll go over some of the things that they normally include. So one very elegant argument is something called surge and decline, and it predicts what voters are going to do, and it's a wonderfully elegant model, and I could spend a half hour explaining it to you. But it is used to explain why the party of the president usually loses seats in midterm elections, right? And it has to do with what voters do in presidential elections and then returning to their normalcy in midterm elections. So there's a surge for the party that wins the presidency, which affects the congressional races, and then 2 years later, there's a decline and they lose some of those seats back. Okay? Not totally discredited, but it's a problem finding it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. The earliest work by a guy named Ed Tufte, and then some others did this, largely based the change in midterm elections on change in presidential job approval rating and change in real disposable income as measured from the third quarter of the year before the election to the third quarter of the year of the election. I knew you wanted to know all that. And the better the economy is and the higher the president's job approval rating, the fewer seats the party of the president loses at midterm. The worse the economy is and the worse job approval rating is, the more likely that the president will lose more seats at midterms. And it is based on voters' reaction to poor performance by the president and to a weak economy, how it affects their own pocketbooks, sort of thing. There's a variation on that which says it's not a direct reaction, it is an indirect reaction, and that candidates a year before the election or a little longer, they use second quarter figures, I knew you wanted to know that, decide whether they're going to run. They decide whether it's going to be a good year for their party. And so the pool of candidates you get when a president's job approval rating is low, and the pool of candidates you get when the economy's not doing well, means that the out party tends to get better candidates running for Congress. And the president's party tends to get worse candidates running for Congress. And that's why that predicts who's going to win and lose. What I added to this mess back when I was doing this stuff, and which some other people did, was looking at exposure or seats at risk. And it was an argument that you can't win you can only win seats you don't have. You can't win seats you already have. You can't improve your margin by winning seats you already have, right? And if you have too many seats, you know, you're above, you've done really well previously, you're going to lose seats. And if you're below where you are, you're going to win seats. And there's a long, elaborate argument as to why this is the case, right? Just think of it this way. If you've got a lot of seats, right? You've got too many seats, especially in House, when we're talking about the House of Representatives. Then you have seats which would normally be won by the other party, but you happen to win them in good years. Right? And the seats that the other party has, it has fewer than it normally would have, are really hardcore seats which you can't win. So it means that, you know, if there's some equilibrium, if you've got too many seats, Republicans probably have 10 or 12 too many House seats right now. Democrats maybe 10 or 12 too few. Given longer-term equilibrium, you'd expect the Republicans under normal conditions to lose 12 and the Democrats to win 12. You know? I try to explain it to my students by talking about the card game of war. Some of you still may remember playing that. And you know, you have 26 cards and you're matching cards and ignoring the wars. You go through one round and one person maybe wins up to 32 cards and the other person is down to 20, right? And when you go through a second round, the person who's got 20 cards wins some back because the person who now has 32 has some really weak cards because they won those weak cards. And that's the same thing that's going on. So this adjustment would go on, right? So that was our addition. And in terms of exposure, if I were still doing it, I would expect the Democrats to pick up about 12 seats if nothing else was going on, right? That would be sort of expectation in the House. And in the Senate, they're in trouble because they're really very much overexposed, more seats at risk. But then you have to take into other. So that's another way of predicting this thing. Then, and I think this is almost cheating, but political scientists are not above that. A lot of people look at the generic vote, and they poll and they ask people, how do you intend to vote in congressional elections this year? Do you intend to vote for a Democratic candidate, and do you intend to vote for a Republican candidate? And they look at the generic vote, what percentage of people say they're going to vote for a Democratic candidate for the House, what percentage of people say they're going to vote for a Republican candidate for the House, and you get a difference there. And a lot of the people with their projection models are using that difference and have used it back to 1948 and find that it fits pretty well with which party gains and loses. The problem is that keeps fluctuating all during the campaign season. So, you know, sometimes it's been at 6 points, sometimes at 8. Some polls have it up to 12 or 14. Which do you use? And, you know, does it do any good to take the generic vote the night before the election and say, well, this is going to happen? Then, you know, what's the sense of forecasting on that? It is important to note, given the way Democrats are distributed and Republicans are distributed across congressional districts, that the Democrats would normally have to win with about a 6% majority in the generic vote to take control of the House because of a variety of reasons about districting that give Republicans an edge in House districts. So that even when Barack Obama was reelected in 2012, Republicans won. He did not carry a majority of House districts. Mitt Romney carried a majority of House districts in 2012. So you got the generic vote sort of picture, right? Then there's people who say, well, let's combine some of this with all that. Remember the seat predictions? Let's combine our economic vote and our presidential job approval rating, and then the prediction from those seat predictions, and see what we get. And take that into account, because that's a measure of seats at risk. And then a new person says, I think we should look at level of enthusiasm and use enthusiasm to predict it. So if one party, what's the enthusiasm gap at midterms between the two parties? Okay, so they've all written papers on this year, right? They all talk very relatively conservative approaches, and they were guessing on what the generic would be. And the predictions range from a 26-seat gain to a 44-seat gain. And least think that this is a partisan exercise. The most Republican, and I mean rock-ribbed Republican who does political science, who does this forecasting. He doesn't give an inch when you try to argue real politics with him. His model predicted a 44-seat Democratic gain. So, different models, different results. My guess is it's sufficient to, some of them do really nice things which show, depending on what the generic vote is, not only what's the likely seat gain, what's the probability that one party or the other will be a majority party in the House. So most of the models, these forecasting models, are predicting Democrats will gain enough seats to win control. Now, will it be controlled by a few seats, or will it be controlled with, you realize, you know, if you have 44 seats, that gives you about almost a 20-seat margin, but you double it, it's 40 seats, right, difference. Because it's, when you gain it, the other party is losing it. So that doesn't tell you. The Senate, by the way, the people who try to predict the Senate think the Senate 1 to 2 seat Republican gain, but the Senate's hard to do because it's so idiosyncratic on a few races, right? You know, you could be wrong or right on all 8 of those races. They're very, very idiosyncratic. Things may go on. What's going to happen is harder to predict, right? Okay. Will the toss-up split evenly? You know, everybody says, oh, all those toss-up races, there are 8 toss-up races for the Senate. They're going to split evenly. That's the best guess, right? They're coin flips. Wrong. You don't believe me? Here are toss-up Senate contests from 2004 to 2016. They split, going back to 2004, 4 Republican wins, 1 Democratic win. 2006, 4 Republicans, 1 Democrat, 5 Democrats, 1 Republican, 4 Democrats, 0 Republicans, 3-2 in 2010, but that's because it was such a push that the Republicans won 4 Senate seats held by Democrats. 2012, it split was 7-1. 2014, it was 1-6. 2016, it was 5-2. None of those is an even split. One party or the other wins a disproportionate share of toss-up Senate races, and the same is true for House. Right? The Republicans' problem is maybe they'll win a disproportionate share of the House toss-ups, but they're so disadvantaged that it's probably hard for them to hold a majority. Wait and see about that. So the big thing, the big lesson to learn about this is toss-ups won't split evenly, and the reason they won't split evenly is usually in the election there is some movement going on favoring one party or the other. And that probably moves a disproportion of those toss-ups in one direction. You just don't get a split down the middle. So don't think that those 8 toss-up seats are going to split 4-4. They may, but I think it's much more likely they'll split 6-2, whether they'll split 6-2 for the Republicans or 6-2 for the Democrats. That I can't tell you. Okay. Volatility. Midterm elections are much more volatile than presidential elections. And there are a couple of reasons that they appear more volatile. One, the polling in presidential election years is a lot better. They're polling nationally. The polls really weren't very far off in 2016 on the popular vote. Pretty close, actually. They take a lot of hits, but they really weren't that bad. The polling on Senate and House races is not as good. And on gubernatorial races, not as good. For a vast variety of reasons. You don't have a lot of polling being done on House races. Not many House seats. And the polling isn't very good, and it may be being done locally. The samples may not be drawn as carefully. There are all sorts of reasons. The amount of money that gets invested in doing the polling is not the same. And then we have to aggregate all those separate seats, right? And even when you use the generic vote as the poll basis, part of the problem is translating percentage of vote that a party's going to win nationally for the House of Representatives into the number of seats you're going to win. It's not a very clean translation. So that's one reason. The polls aren't as good. Polling data isn't as good. We don't have as good information. The second reason goes out to candidates aren't as well known. I mean, by the time you got to this point in a presidential election year, you know a great deal about the candidates. 90-somewhat% of the voters are probably locked in a month before the election, if not more, in a presidential election year. In House and Senate elections, you're very often just still learning about candidates. You knew in 2016 whether you were going to vote for Trump or Obama, or Clinton, and that was not, you weren't going to change. You were locked in. You knew a lot about them. Whether you liked what you heard or didn't like what you heard, you knew what you were doing. They were the restaurants you had gone to 100 times. An individual meal that you were going to get at the next visit to the restaurant wasn't going to change your opinion of how good the restaurant was. A lot of House and Senate candidates you don't know a lot about, or you know less about, especially if they're not an incumbent, and they're the restaurants you haven't visited many times. And so each new bit of information may change your opinion. Not of a lot of voters, But maybe instead of 10% being in play, 20% are still in play in some ways, in some races. Right? So it's more volatile because you don't know as much about the candidates. And if you still get new information, that new information actually can change your mind. So you have to think about that volatility difference. Finally, as I mentioned, turnout's different. Right? Turnout's lower than a presidential year. Differentials in turnouts, the other problem that you have with a lot of pollsters, and my colleague Josh Clinton, when he talks to you, polls is when you try to predict likely voters. Who's a likely voter? Who isn't a likely voter? That's predicting what turnout's going to be in some ways. And especially in elections where turnout's lower, that's more important. It's harder to predict House and Senate races individually. Okay, one more point, and then I'll open to questions. I can be wrong, and I've been wrong before. You don't come to a political scientist for predictions on elections and then go bet on them. You don't go to an economist and find out where that economist thinks what stocks are going to go up or down and then go invest your money. We do really good things as academics, but some things we get out of our depth. So my sense is, have I been wrong? Yes. Am I right more than I'm wrong? Probably. But I remember the times I'm wrong a lot more than the times I'm right. So, yeah, I don't even want to share these with you. They're too embarrassing. I'm older and wiser than some of the times I was wrong. But it's hard. It's inexact. But I can tell you what things you ought to watch. Right? And the 10 things I'm talking about, yeah. And if I can be wrong, a lot of other people can be wrong. Right? But I'd watch, what's happening to women candidates, the mix of states that are up, the change in the generic vote, right? The volatility that may be out there, the level of enthusiasm, to the degree that you can get good measures at that. And that'll give you and then you don't have to listen to the darn talking heads who tell you so much that isn't right. I mean, I watch a lot of that. I don't care what stations you watch, what channels you watch. I want you to be good, informed voters. And regardless of who you watch, the talking heads, a lot of them don't know what they're talking about. But they get paid. So you just have to realize that. And it's not only that they may have a political or ideological axe to grind, it's that they say things which are just wrong often. They have expectations which are just wrong. So with those warnings, I'll be happy to take questions. I know there are things I did not cover, so please feel free to ask questions. Yes? Well, yes, the question in terms of volatility, how much could Taylor Swift influence elections? I suspect there are some number of individuals who were influenced by Taylor Swift, maybe to register when they weren't registered. Whether they'll then vote or not is a question. I suspect there are people who like Taylor Swift, who think her political opinions are important and were moved positively. And I suspect there are people who don't like Taylor Swift or don't like her anymore, whose votes were, but I don't think it's a large number. The question is what she's saying symptomatic of activation that may be going on among younger potential women voters? Not what Taylor Swift's saying and whether she's influencing anybody. The question is it symptomatic or is it an outlier and not something we should pay attention to? So, yes, the people who are celebrities are reference points for some folks for voting. but I don't think it amounts to too much. Yes, sir.
I've heard the adage that negative advertisement works. Does it?
Gentleman said he heard the adage that negative advertisement works. Does it? Two things to say about that. One is the best research shows that it is effective to the degree that any advertising is effective, that people focus on it more, they remember it more, it discriminates among the candidates more, but there's the problem that we tend only to pay much attention to things about our own candidates we already like, and we tend to discount ads for the candidates we don't like. And we tend to, as soon as we see, it's depending on where you are in Tennessee, if it's a Blackburn ad or a Bredesen ad, you may just hit your remote, right? You know, who consumes those sorts of things? The people who consume most of those ads, you know, and really pay attention to them are people who are already interested in politics and know a lot. So they're less likely to be moved. Nevertheless, you're trying to move a small percentage of the electorate, not a big percentage of the electorate. You're not trying to move 30 or 40 or 50% of the electorate with these negative ads. You're trying to move 2, 3, 4, 5% of the electorate, right? So there is some, and again, when you know less about candidates, they can have a bigger effect, you know? That's, you know, they can help mobilize your base. That sort of thing seems to go on. But I think there is a House candidate Democratic House candidate, Amy McGrath, who's in Lexington, Kentucky. She's a former pilot. She's running against a Republican incumbent and is not using negative ads and made a point of not using race. She's testing that. I don't know whether we'll be able to tell from her not using negative ads whether that has any effect or not. But, you know, I don't know if that answers your question. Most political scientists think they're more effective, but then again, they show a lot of stuff and they show that the effect of ads is less than we think they are. There was a gentleman here, and then I'll switch over to the other side. Yes, sir.
What are your thoughts on a mandatory vote?
What are my thoughts on a mandatory vote? There are societies which do have mandatory voting, where there are penalties for not voting. It strikes me that it's always probably good in society for people to have the ability to say they don't like the choices or to not participate. I view it voting somewhat differently than some of my colleagues might, and occasional one who won't vote, who think that, you know, your vote isn't really worth much. You know, economic view of voting. My view of voting is that it's a, you know, baseline citizen. We have responsibilities. We don't have always rights and liberties. We have responsibilities, and so I view voting and a number of other things as responsibilities of citizenship in democratic society. I don't think you should coerce people into vote who don't want to vote. You should make it accessible to them and have an ability to vote. One reason we don't have as high voting turnout in the United States, aside from some of our registration laws, is we have so many elections compared to other societies. That's good and bad. If we had fewer elections, we'd probably have more turnout. On the other hand, having a lot of elections and having frequent elections can be desirable because it gives you a quick chance to, you know, we make mistakes sometimes, and it gives you a quick opportunity to say, oh, that was a mistake. Let's change what we did, you know. So I think that, you know, it's probably a good thing. In places that have mandatory voting, one indication of participation is spoiled ballots. And so we actually have one graduate student in our department who recently got a job, and she's been studying the amount of which spoiled ballots show something about participation instead of voting, because it's not a good measure of people participating, right? if you want to increase turnout, there are lots of things you do. State of Oregon has mail ballots, right? Anybody from Oregon here? Actually, you don't go to polling place, you get a mail ballot, and they have pretty high turnout in Oregon. It's gone up since they've gone to a mail ballot. So, I'm sorry, there was, oh, yes?
I think I understood you say there are no House seats up for election in Tennessee, so what does that mean for Diane Black, non-black?
Oh, they were open seats. Once they declared for another office and were running, they did not file for re-election. So both of those seats are open, and there will be new members elected in those seats. Yes, yeah, that's a good question. In some states, most notably, when somebody runs for president in Texas, for example, Lyndon Johnson was able to run for re-election to his Senate seat at the same time when he ran for president. There are some states that will allow that. Most states would not allow that. You have to give up an office to run for another office. Right? Yeah. So Tennessee is one of those. Yes. Yeah, you can't run for two things. Yes.
I know your times are changing. One of the more remarkable things that I observed in the presidential election was the enormous number of people that turned out for Trump. And it is very hard if people come out for any type of a political rally. We had no problem filling theaters. I don't think that those are the people that I typically thought of as.
Yeah.
And so under the times that they are changing, is this just a rare phenomenon? Or is it that the cult of personality is now going to be the successor to people who are politically astute?
In presidential election years, I think we do not want to mix up. Oh, yes. The question on times where they were changing, the question is the intensity of people who turned out for Trump at rallies in 2016. Is this telling us anything? And clearly we can have reactions, actions, and reactions. But the point about it is in presidential election years, intensity of people showing up at rallies because turnout tends to be pretty high is not necessarily as good an indicator as to what's likely to happen. And the question is, and I'm not clear on this, and it's not clear that Trump brought a lot of people who weren't voting into voting, right? And in fact, despite that intensity, his voters may have been more intense than Clinton voters, although that's hard to measure. It was not a popular vote victory, so intensity may have predicted the outcome of the Electoral College, but it didn't predict the outcome of the popular vote in 2016. So you would expect if the intensity was really there, that would have happened, right? But intensity is clearly important. It was most important in getting him nominated in the first place, because that's when turnout is lower, right, in those presidential primaries. And especially in a large field presidential primary, being able to deliver your votes is critical, right? The important thing for winning a presidential nomination, and I'm getting outside of, but if you want to think forward to 2020, the important thing for winning a presidential nomination at the beginning is to have depth of support when the field is large. People who are going to go to vote for you no matter what, where you're the first choice, right? And especially when you have 16 or 17 candidates, you don't want to be everybody's second choice. And then as the field narrows, you need breadth of support. Right? Yes, where am I? Let me get this gentleman. We'll go around, and I'll try to get as many of you as I can.
Yeah, how much of the polling that is done today is still dependent upon people who have landline phones?
How much of the polling that is done is dependent upon people who have landline phones? Less. They are hitting cell phones now. There is some online polling which is taking place. It's still a problem. There are all sorts of problems with polling by phone now, even if you're, I don't know how many of you do not answer your phones unless you know who's calling. There are problems associated with it. There are online polls that are done. The ones that are the worst are the polls which are the automated polls. That's the shakiest. There are all sorts of things. Again, save that for Professor Clinton. He'll give you a better answer than I will. But there are a lot of headaches involved in polling, and cell phones and technology generally are opening up new avenues, but they require certain assumptions. Yes?
Can you talk about how polls miss the boat in grassroots campaigns like Alexandria or
Yes, and Ms. Cortez won a congressional primary in Queens, New York, Queens County, against a Congressman Crowley, who's a long-term incumbent. One, I don't know that you can poll very well, who was doing the polling in that House district. Second, turnout was very low. So intensity makes a huge difference when turnout is low. New York, moreover, has a closed primary, so you had to be an enrolled Democrat to vote. She had grassroots support and more enthusiastic backing. He had spent a lot of time in Washington, was an important player in Washington, but you're always more vulnerable under those situations. Again, the lower turnout is, the harder things are to predict, and the more turnout can make a difference. And when you're talking about a House primary in Queens, boy, being able to mobilize your people is really, really critical. So yes, you can have some upsets then. Not expected, but when you have lots of these, you're going to get some, right? And a year in which being an incumbent wasn't necessarily a good thing, wasn't an attribute. Yes? Yes, sir.
Where is mandatory voting, and how do you enforce it?
There, it is held in a number of countries, some of which are democratic countries, some of which are authoritarian. If you do not vote and go in, you have to pay a fine. And the question is whether that is enforceable or not. But they have pretty, and in some of the authoritarian countries, the consequences can be greater, obviously. But yes, there are a number of countries where voting is mandatory. I don't do comparative politics, but my friends upstairs could give you a list. And you probably can Google that and find out where mandatory voting is required.
Professor, thank you so much. Your time is up. Thank you.
Thank you all. I appreciate your coming out.